Okay, so this is the current top that I use for my Korra costume, and right now it's okay. It's definitely wearing down. I've been wearing this for the last few years now, and it's starting to peel a little bit, but the construction is majority good. I made this pattern from scratch and kind of put it together how I thought it should go. There's a couple of things that I want to change about it for this new one. The main one is that this is the way I currently open it, and I have like a hook and eye tape that I attach everything in. But because of the way this was made, I have to put a pin here to hold that in place, and then I have to put a pin over here to hold that in place because this will start to drop and then deform. So I want to make this one solid piece. That way I don't have to worry about that anymore. And I need to figure out how to break that down into those parts so that I can have those pattern pieces that I need. The front is just the main issue. And then of course I want to make this into a bodysuit, so I have to figure out the pattern pieces for that. Now when it comes to the back of this, I think it's really well done. Like there's nothing I think I need to change about it. So I'll be copying these back pieces and these side pieces here. And then what I need to do is figure out if I need to separate it into another piece for the bottom or continue it all the way down and what that would look like. So in this video, I'll be trying to figure all of that out while I'm doing this process, and I hope you guys can learn some things along the way. Alright, so I have grabbed myself a piece of cotton fabric that I believe should be long enough to draft this whole pattern on. I'm going to cut it in half, so hopefully this will end up being the length I need it to be for the full top and bottom of it. I mean, front and back of it. And I'm just taking some pins and putting it on here just to hold it in place while I start working on everything. Okay, so hopefully I have my mic working now. I am going to be taking my scissors and kind of cutting away the excess fabric that I will not need for this. So let's pull this off the neck first. Actually, I don't think I'm going to talk during this process, and then just do a voiceover for it. So I'm starting off by pinning the fabric to the mannequin, and I'm getting myself a pen so that I can mark the lines of where I think things should line up at. So I'm going to be taking this Sharpie, but I'm going to change it out for something a little bit different because it just ended up bleeding too much. But I want to get an idea of the lines that I want to put in there. So I'm trying to figure out where I want that front piece to hit. So I'm just giving some rough guesses of where I want that to be. And here you see me start to mark out the center line, and I want to make sure that I get that as even as possible because I'll be using that later on to make some decisions on where things need to line up at and matching them for the opposite side. Now, when it comes to making these pattern pieces, it's always a bit of jumping around trying to figure out what you need next. So here I am going to the shoulder seam, and I'm just marking out there and guessing about where I want that to fall at. And then I'm taking those lines and making it go around that armhole. And I'm using this mannequin's actual sizing and stuff like that to kind of give me a guideline. And that's the best way I found that I could do this. And then I can just take those pattern pieces and make any adjustments that I need to after that. So here you can just see that I'm just marking out where I think those lines should fall, or just kind of following that armhole. And I'm making sure that I pull that fabric so that it lays as flat as possible, because that will give me the best version of that pattern piece. Throughout this whole process, you'll see that I keep referring back to the original piece so that I could make sure that I am getting the lines in the places I want them to be. So I'm just going to keep on bringing that back out to do just that. After referencing the top, I wanted to go ahead and start marking out that side curve for that first piece that I'm working on. And I just started it a little bit because I started to notice that the fabric was just moving around a little too much. So I wanted to try to get it more precise, and I just decided to take those pins and smooth out the fabric to make it a little bit easier for when I'm trying to draw those lines. So now that I've smoothed it out a little more and have the fabric holding in place, I'm going to finish out by doing some dotted lines, and I'm following the curves of the mannequin to kind of get an idea of where I want those seams to line up. And here I'm down by the hip, and I'm just kind of bringing it back out so that it has a little more of an hourglass shape to it. At this point, I started to get a little bit confused on what piece I was working on, and I had to pull out my piece one more time just to see what piece I was working on, because at first I thought I was working on the center piece, but it ended up just working out better for me to start with that shoulder piece, because that would be a piece that would be cut out and then sewn to the larger part of it. Now that I have that piece to where I think it's at its best, I'm going to go ahead and just straighten up the lines a little bit more, and I'm going to take my scissors and cut this piece out. Now, after I take the piece off of the mannequin, I am going in there with my ruler and the marker and just marking out where I want those seam allowances to be and marking out the actual shape of it. So I'm getting the shape together first, and then I'm going back in and adding that seam allowance to make sure that I have roughly about 5/8 of a seam allowance, so that I have enough to make adjustments where I need to in the pattern pieces when they're finally done. Now it's time for me to move on to that second piece, and I'm just laying the first one back onto the mannequin exactly where I pretty much grabbed it from, and I'm laying the other one over it. And here I'm just doing a little bit of overlap so that I can see where I need that seam allowance to be. And then I'm just drawing that line straight across because that's where those two pieces are going to meet up. And then I'm going to move to the other side and try to mirror the piece that I've done before onto that side. And I'm just trying to line up the best I can so that they are kind of mirror images of each other. And I'm just going to continue this process of drawing out the lines and following the different markings. And then later on, I go in there and just make sure that they're the right widths so that the seams from the front and back will line up exactly the same. As you can see, when doing this pattern piece, I was trying to make sure that that top half was the best, and the bottom, I just got a rough idea of what I needed those curves to be, because later on, I'm going to go back and actually get the accurate shape that I'll need for that crotch piece. As I'm starting to work through each one of the pattern pieces, I will be taking some of those like wonder clips, I believe they're called, and using those to clip the pieces together just to make sure that I can still continue the shape and get the lines to match up for each pattern piece that I'm creating. So here I'm starting with that front side piece, and I'm just trying to pin it so that it is nice and smooth. That way when I'm drawing my lines, they're going to be as straight as possible. So I'm going to be drawing straight lines along this and then following along the lines of the previous pattern piece, and that gives me the best like possible version of that pattern piece. So at this point I have already created the back pieces, and I'm now starting to work on the collar. Something that I did notice as I was looking through this is that I could have made those two side pieces one piece and wouldn't have that seam on the side. So if that's something that you want to do, you can try to figure out a way to combine those two pattern pieces together and make it one piece. But I like the fact that it has that seam on the side, so I'm going to keep that in with mine. But working on this neck, I was basically just following along the lines that I had already created on the neckline. And I created two pieces on here because I wanted to be more of a stand-up neck, and that was the way I best knew how to do it. So here you just see me figuring out how to lay the fabric because the way I lay the fabric is going to determine how I cut it out on the fabric. So I have to be mindful that I'm putting the grain going the right way and that it'll lay the way I want it to, or have enough stretch to lay the way I want it to. So now I want to give you guys just a quick look at how everything is coming together, and with the clips you get a really good idea of how these pieces are going together and the way it looks on there. So after I got to this point, what I did is take it off the mannequin and I wanted to try it on myself just to make sure that everything was lining up correctly. And there definitely were some areas where I needed to make adjustments so that I would know where I needed to make those adjustments once I had all the pattern pieces out. Now, as you can see on these pattern pieces, they're not lining up on every piece. So what I'm going to do is take my ruler and make sure that these lines match up so that when I'm cutting it out on the fabric, those pieces, once I sew them together, they're going to line up and have a nice curve to them. And I'm also making adjustments for how wide or narrow I need certain areas to be. Okay, so after trying this out on myself, I figured out that there's a couple of spots that I still need to make adjustments to. So I made markings there, and now I'm just going to straighten up those lines, cut off the excess, and then I'm going to sew it up together using a fabric that's going to be similar to what I'm going to be wearing for the cosplay. Okay, so I have two fabrics that I've decided that I'm going to go with, and these two are not exactly the same, but they do have the same amount of width stretch. It's just this one's a little more stretchy than lengthwise, but it was the closest thing in my stash that I had to be able to do this mock-up one. So I'm going to be using this. I'm just going to go through the whole process. I'm also going to be figuring out how things need to be sewn together so that they go together well, and I don't have any like weird things that I have to try to do. So that is something that I will be trying to figure out on this project, because I didn't really have to do it for the last one. Sorry guys, I definitely forgot to record a clip of me actually trying on that pattern piece, but everything ended up matching up really nicely, so I figured it was a good point to go on ahead and use my fabric, my final fabric, to go on ahead and cut out all these pieces. So there wasn't actually any adjustments I made after I sewed everything together, and I was able to just put it right there on the fabric. And I definitely had to be very, very careful on like how I was placing things together, because I definitely made the mistake of sewing the wrong pieces together and sewing things upside down, inside out. So I had to be real sure about where I was putting these pieces once I was sewing them together. So to help me do that process, what I did was put little marks with chalk on the right side of the fabric, and that helped me make sure that I was sewing the right pieces together and also sewing them the right way together. So here you can see that a majority of the pieces are on the fold of the fabric, which means that I'll be doing two pieces of those and they need to be mirrored. But there were two pieces on this pattern that need to be just the one side, and I only needed to cut out one of those. So for those, I had to be really careful on which way I laid the pattern piece down. That way I made sure that the right side of the fabric would be facing out in the final. So I definitely had to be really careful, and you'll see that I go and flip this so that it's actually on the right side, because I had laid it down and it would have been mirrored to where it actually is going to be on that pattern piece. So to help me make sure that I was putting all the pieces together correctly, I made sure that I kept the pattern pieces with each piece, and I clipped each piece together, and I did the front and then the back as separate things. But as you can see, I do have like markings there to show me which side is the right side of the fabric. So I'm taking each one of the pieces and making sure I line them up so that the right sides are facing together, and I'm putting them the right side up, and I'm adding those clips just to make sure that I don't lose a piece and put it in incorrectly. So I'm doing all the pieces together and then clipping them together, doing the front, taking all those pieces and clipping them together. and this helped me minimize the time I was taking things apart because I had put the wrong piece together. Alright, so now that I have all of my pieces actually clipped together, now I feel comfortable that I can go ahead and take these pieces to the sewing machine. So a tip that I want to give you guys when it comes to sewing things together like this and you're not quite sure if everything's going to come out correctly is do a wider stitch length. That way, whenever you're doing a wider stitch length, you can make it easier on yourself whenever it comes time to take out a seam because you put it in incorrectly. If you use something that's a little bit tighter, then it makes it a lot harder. So that's going to be the difference between you taking like a minute to unpick a seam or an hour. So at this point, I have gone ahead and done all of the seams for the front and back. And now I'm going to finally sew those together. And I am going through and doing a serged edge for each one of the seams, so that will be what I'm working on next. The next step would be to sew the shoulder seams together, and this will allow it to be ready to actually add the collar piece in. The collar, I need 4 pieces cut out of each of the pattern pieces. Half of the pattern will need to have lightweight interfacing. This will help the collar stand up. I need to make sure that the interfacing is facing the outside layer. This is where I had another mistake on my mock-up. Because the interfacing only stretches on one side, the way I oriented the fabric made a big difference on how much stretch it had around the neck. So now that I've ironed on the interfacing and sewn the collar pieces together, it's time to add it to the top. So now I'm just taking my clips and I am slowly clipping every piece together, making sure that I stretch it where it needs to be so that everything fits on there evenly. Now it's time to take the bias tape that I made with the white fabric and add it into the collar. Now for this, I'm sure I'm going from one side of the collar all the way down to the part that ends near the shoulder. At the shoulder, I'm going to fold the bias tape down so that when I sew over it, it'll have a natural kind of fall off and it won't be like a raw edge. At this point, I've gone ahead and closed up the collar by adding the second piece. And now I need to sew the shoulder piece to the front piece. And that's just going to be like a straight line. And then I can go ahead and add the same white fabric to the armholes. This was definitely my least favorite part of putting this together, but it was something that I could not avoid. I needed to do some hand sewing so that I could close up that collar on the inside, and that was the best way I figured that I could actually do this. So I just sat down at my computer, put on some music, and just got the sewing. I don't know how to say this, but I went ahead and finished everything. I put in the bias tape on the arms. What else did I do? I finished sewing up the neck, which I do have clips of me doing that part, but the rest of this was mostly just hand sewing. And like I tried using some new snaps because that was the only thing I could get my hand on. Didn't have the proper tools to do that. So I ended up having to hand stitch some snaps onto the bottom, and they are not aligned in the slightest. But I am glad they are finally done. I had to like hand stitch the last little bit of that because I couldn't run it through the sewing machine. But it's done. I finished it. Here it is. It's inside out right now. There are a couple of things that are not quite where I would want them to be, but overall good. The neck right here is a little too small, so I definitely have to squeeze my head through there. But this is the snaps, and as you can see, they are not aligned in the slightest. But I did my best. They line up with each other, so that's really the main thing. So I can snap those together, and everything is done. So I'm just glad that this is finally done. And I'm supposed to make a second one, but when I went back to the fabric store, they did not have the color I needed. So I will have to use this as my color, and you can barely tell here, but they're slightly different colors, but I'm not wearing it together, so it shouldn't make that much of a difference as far as putting it on. But I just wanted to show you guys I finally finished it. So it's done. It fits great. Everything is good, and I will go ahead and show you what it looks like. There you have it, my fellow crafty creatures. Our creative adventure has led us to the final stitches of the amazing Korra bodysuit. I hope you enjoyed joining me on this sewing journey. If you love this video and want to see more cosplay, crafting, and DIY projects, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. Stay tuned for more nerdy inspirations and crafting fun. I love hearing from you and can't wait to see your own crafting and cosplay creations. Thank you for being a part of this incredible community, and remember, cosplay is more than just costumes. It's about embracing your favorite characters and bringing their magic to life. Keep crafting, keep cosplaying, and keep on being awesome.